Welcome to Life Group Live. We're following the genealogy of Jesus, and of course we start off with Abraham, the patriarch, and we work our way through 2,000 years of history, basically covering the majority of the Bible. Currently we're with the descendant in Matthew chapter 1 verse 4, looking at Nahshon. So he's related to Moses and Aaron. His sister Elisheba is actually married to Aaron. And so tonight we'll also see a couple more relatives, and you realise how close the descendants in the genealogy of Jesus are actually connected to the events that are actually transpiring when Moses leads the people out of Egypt. So last week we had a look up into the parting of the Red Sea and the Israelites going through, and tonight we pick up from there with the Egyptian chariots chasing into the water. So there'll be some historical context added to this, but tonight's lesson is Moses leads the Israelites to Mount Sinai. So this is the next stage in that journey. So we'll be running up to the point of the 10 Commandments, and then we're going to go into a lot of learning around the 10 Commandments, the formation of the tabernacle, God's laws, the change in society, etc. So we're in Exodus. We're in Exodus chapter 14, and the last reading that we had from there was actually verse 22. So we're going to kick off tonight in verse 24 to verse 25. And it says, the Egyptians were pursuing the Israelites into the sea, and it says, during the last watch of the night, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud at the Egyptian army and threw it into confusion. He made the wheels of the chariots come off so that they had difficulty driving, and the Egyptians said, let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt. So there's a couple of things happening in there. We explained last night that last week, that travelling across what was the Red Sea, or termed the Red Sea, in fact happened in 3 hours. It was in the last quarter of the night. So you may remember the quarters are from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m, 9 p.m. to midnight, midnight to 3 in the morning, and from 3 to 6. So it was the last quarter. We know that they actually went across from 3 to 6 in the dark in the morning before the sun rose. So from looking at the movements on the map and what the Bible tells us, we spoke about in those days there was actually canals there that hemmed them in, and obviously this distance of actually getting across the water for a couple of million people with their animals and their unleavened bread, etc., it would have been a very difficult exercise, a lot of people to get across a period of time. There's a lot of theories that said they go across to the other side of the Red Sea into North Arabia. But when we read the Bible, we find out in one day that they travel this distance and become hemmed in, and that night they actually go across. So you can imagine they're on foot. There's a limited distance they can go across. But if you look at lesson 16 on the YouTube channel for the Jesus Movement, you'll be able to review that. So picking up here, first of all, we're told that we've got these 3 hours. We know that the Israelites have gone through, and then it says that the Lord looked down and threw the Egyptian army into confusion, wheels coming off, etc. But the Egyptians said, let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt. So you may remember that the scripture last week talked about how Pharaoh's heart, after the Israelites had actually been told to get out, it says that the Lord hardened the Pharaoh's heart once again. So that means that the Lord hasn't finished with the Egyptians. He's got an agenda. So what do we think that agenda is? And here he's saying they're recognising the Lord, they're recognising the Israelite people, because they're saying that he's fighting for them against Egypt. So why was the Pharaoh's heart hardened this time? I did speak about this last week. What do you think? Any thoughts? Remember the chariots. What did the chariots carry? It carried all of the leaders, all of the senior people of Egypt, including the Pharaoh. Right, there were 600 of them plus some other people, it said. So basically, the Lord hardened the Pharaoh's heart, he collected all of his senior people, jumped on the chariots, and went off after the Israelites. So of course at this point in time they go into the Red Sea, the wheels fall off, they start to realise that the Lord's fighting against them. But the point is that the Lord hardened the Pharaoh's heart because he actually wanted them to come and chase his people into the water, because he was going to do something to them, and that's that he's going to end their lives. So that means when you take out the whole leadership of a nation, they're in disarray afterwards. Right? God wanted to protect his people so that there would be no further repercussions coming against him, against the Israelites. So this is what he actually did. So once they were safely on the other side, now last week I did, just to recap, we are talking about Nahshon and the genealogy, so we're following from the perspective of each of the descendants. You might remember Nahshon is the leader of the tribe of Judah. They are the biggest tribe, and they will always go first, and there's a lot of scriptures which I gave you last week that tells you that they always went first. So that means Nahshon, as the leader of the tribe of Judah, was the first person to go into the Red Sea. Right? The extra-biblical Jewish midrash actually said that he walked in up to his neck, and then the waters started to part. The Bible tells us that the wind from the east that came across from the Sinai Peninsula actually blew and parted the waters. So whichever way it physically happened, Nahshon was first in leading his people, so he was first off the other side. The other significant thing, of course, was about Moses, because when the chariots came after them, he said, look, no worries, God's got it. And of course God said to Moses, get off your backside, get your staff, which God gave to him, which is the symbol of his authority and his power, and you're to hold it up above the waters at the Red Sea, and thereby saying that faith is an active thing. You actually have to do something. God will work through you, but you are to get up and you are to do and show your people that it's not through you as the leader, but in fact it's through the power of God. We spoke quickly about how with the staff, and we come across this soon, how later in the story he thumps it against the rock for the water, and he says, must I? And that was it. He never made it into the promised land because of it, because he had an arrogance that it was by his power and by his doing that he was supplying water to the Israelites. But in fact the purpose of the staff of God was something so significant that without it God didn't act through him. Later on we learn that that staff actually buds into an almond tree, budding, and actually ends up as part of the Ark of the Covenant in the tabernacle and in the Temple of Jerusalem. It's a very significant piece of wood. So this is what he raised at this time. So reading on, so safely on the other side, God told Moses again to stretch out his hand over the sea. So here that God told Moses, so he's instructing him. He did this at daybreak, and the sea swept back into place, and the Egyptians were drowned. In verse 28 of Exodus 14, it says, not one of them survived. In verse 30 it goes on and says, that day the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. This was one of those comments that I mentioned about it being a canal. The body of water was not so huge, because when these people were drowned, 600 odd chariots, the bodies are actually on the shore. So if it was a huge body of water, you wouldn't be having these bodies immediately on the shore. So it was done. The Egyptian Pharaoh, whom his people believed to be a god, was dead. And it was just as God said in Exodus 14 verse 18, the Egyptians will know I am the Lord when I gain glory through Pharaoh, his chariots and his horsemen. So in other words, God's showing that his power, he actually defeated the Pharaoh. We have to understand that the Pharaohs were seen as a god, so he was leading his army into battle. So the Egyptians would think that he is a god, no one will beat him, he's all powerful. But of course this situation that happens where when the waters close in, they say, get out, the Lord is fighting against us. So they recognise that the God of Israel is more powerful than the Pharaoh. And in fact, the Pharaoh and all of his men die. Now, I talked about whom the Pharaoh is. So we're talking about Ramses the First. And historically, we actually know he was an elderly Pharaoh. So when he ascended the throne. So his death was actually not expected. Obviously he's gone in chasing them. His son is Seti the first, who becomes the next Pharaoh. And what we find out is that where Pharaoh Ramses the first was buried, he was buried in a very quickly and rapidly made tomb, which is unlike the pharaohs, because normally they spend a lot of time building their tombs for the afterlife. So obviously it wasn't expected that his time had actually come. So this sort of sows into this unexpected outcome where the pharaoh was actually killed by the God of Israel. Any questions at this point? All good?
Seti is he the son?
So Seti's the son.
Well, he must be the second son then.
Right, so remember I mentioned last lesson, the one before, that the records are on the tomb. It's actually recorded that he had 6 members of his family. So that means that he had more than one child. He had at least 4. Okay, his firstborn son was obviously killed. But remember might have been last week or the week before, I told you to take out of your mind that the firstborn were actually all the kids. You know, the biblical record tells us about the children being killed before they're 1 or 2 because they're actually trying to catch a particular child, like Jesus, like Moses. But in this particular instance, it says the firstborn of all Egyptians.
Yeah.
So the age is irrelevant in this particular case, so we mustn't assume that there was a little child. And in fact, in history, it says that he had a crown prince who was actually killed. And so he never made it to the throne. And so Seti the first is his next son, and he's actually the head of one of the armies. So I mentioned last week that I'm going to tell you a bit about them going up into the land of Canaan, today's Israel, and the connection there, and I've got some maps for you. So basically there's some events that happen, and Seti the first is actually away when his father drowns, but he goes looking for the Israelites. Right? He goes looking for all these points on the Jordan River where they were crossed from the other side because they hadn't gone along the coast road. So he was expecting them to turn up somewhere else. But then when he learns that his father's died, he hightails it back to Egypt, because in those days with no other leaders and the son away, some other person's going to step in and take the throne from him. The Israelites, having suffered so much in Egypt, this just leads into that verse, had little faith in their Lord God. This defeat enabled the Israelites to witness, and this is from the scripture, great power with which the Lord had defeated the Egyptians. They stood in awe of the Lord, and they had faith in the Lord and in his servant Moses. So that's Exodus 14 verse 31. So we have this significant change here, don't we? Because up until this point in time, the people who have been living in Egypt, their faith wasn't so good. It took all of these plagues to actually, not just to get their exit out of Egypt, but to actually grow the faith of the people that God's power was and authority was greater than whom they were actually under Egyptian rule. And so we find in this circumstance, after they've come out and they've seen the Pharaoh, so they're actually outside of the boundary of Egypt for the first time. The Pharaoh and his leaders are all gone. Remember, they plundered, so in other words, they were given wealth to take with them, and they're now out of slavery. So the 2 things it says here is that they were in awe of the Lord, they had faith in the Lord. So faith, there's a big word. And also said also in the servant Moses. So they obviously finally acknowledged that Moses was a worthy leader to lead them out, and God was actually using Moses. So God's plan of restoration has come to pass. Jacob's sons, so we spoke about this whole, so we're looking at the big picture here now. So when we go back to Jacob, Jacob's sons were not unified or faithful to either their father on earth nor their father in heaven. The sin of Judah and his brothers had been punished for 4 generations. So we've been going through the genealogy. So the generations that were in Egypt, Perez, Hezron, Ram and Amminadab, were now with Nahshon because he's coming out of Egypt. So it says 4 generations. And now in the 5th generation, during the life of Nahshon, God rescues them through his awesome power to unify them as a nation and restore them back in faith. Now in Exodus 20 verse 5, if you read it, it actually says that God punished the children for the sin of the fathers to the 3rd and 4th generation. So this is tied to the commandments in Exodus 20. So he talks about when he punishes to the 3rd and 4th generation. So we find out here that when the brothers of Joseph sinned and they sold him into slavery, someone wanted to kill him, they weren't a unified body, they weren't going to form a nation under God, and so the story leads them down into Egypt where they spent this body of time. God says that he will punish for this number of generations, and here we find when we examine it, in fact, those number of generations is exactly how long they actually stayed in the land. So it's quite extraordinary. So the Israelites were free, but the ramification of God's power would send repercussions throughout the region. Repercussions that would help the Israelites as they were guided by the Lord to the promised land of their forefathers. Now the Song of Moses and Miriam, which is in the next book in Exodus, I won't read the whole thing, gave voice to this. In verses 14 to 16 of Exodus 15, it says, "The nations will hear and tremble. Anguish will grip the people of Philistia," so they're the Philistines. "The chiefs of Edom will be terrified. The leaders of Moab will be seized with trembling. The people of Canaan will melt away. Terror and dread will fall upon them." Now it's curious, isn't it? Because these are all the people that they're about to encounter, conquer, and enter into the land of. Okay, so that in that region, this is big news. Israelites, millions of people have just exited Egypt. The news would have travelled around the area. People would have known that this was going on. They would have heard the stories that the sea parted, the people escaped, and then the sea closed over Pharaoh. They would have heard the stories about the 10 plagues. So they would have this, reverent fear of God by this time, that all of these things had happened. So when the Israelites now start approaching these other nations, of course they're going to be fearful. They're going to be trembling because they're going to be respectful that the God who is actually leading them is more powerful than they are themselves, or perhaps they perceive their gods to be. So we enter into this new phase now. So Moses at this time, he leads Israel away from the Red Sea. So this is where we're going to give you a little bit of historical context about what happens with, once they leave, what happens with Seti the first. So when the Israelites left with the Egyptian army in pursuit, you might remember that when they were leaving, they went to go up to the coast road, and God said, "No, I don't want you to go that way because you'll have to fight the armies." Because this is the route which they travel back and forth. They said, "I'll pass the map around in a second." So what happens is, the historical events at this point in time, is that there was a group of Arabs that attacked Zone. Remember we mentioned Zone? So Zone was a region, and it's right next to Ramses, which is where they were all living and exiting from. So there was a group of Arabs that attacked Zone. So in history it records that his son, Seti, so Ramses the first son, Seti, that he rounded up the palace guards and quickly squashed this uprising. When their plan failed, the Arabs fled and headed along the way of Horus, which is the also known as the way of the land of the Philistines. So it's the coast road through Mount Sinai. And they headed towards Philistia in the land of Canaan. But Seti gave chase, and adding soldiers from his forts, remember I told you there's forts all the way along the line, adding soldiers from the forts along the way, he killed them as they fled. So in other words, they never made it there. But it meant that Seti was on the coast road, and he had left with an army in that direction. So hearing that the Israelites had turned back south when they reached the way of Horus, so they went up and they came back down again, Seti knew they must cross the Sinai Peninsula to return to the land of Canaan from where their ancestors came from. Knowing they weren't travelling by the coast, he understood the other way to enter the land of Canaan would be to travel up the King's Highway. So does anyone know what the King's Highway is? So this is a very historically important highway. The Israelites will actually travel up it a little bit later. So the King's Highway, and again I'll pass the map in a couple of seconds, is actually on the other side of the Dead Sea and the Jordan River. So it comes up from Elat today, or what was called, well there was a couple of names for the place, but the top of the Gulf of Aqaba, right, it had this highway, and it went all the way up through Moab and Ammonites, all those sort of countries, and connected up with the highway that came through the land of Canaan up to northern Mesopotamia. But it was called the King's Highway. And so, being on the other side of the Dead Sea, they would then come across the Jordan River. They could cross in several different places. So it'd be an opportunity that he could seek to attack the Israelites as they went across the river. So I'll grab this map and have a good look at it as I'm talking, and I'll post this onto the YouTube video as well. But I'll just give you a quick explanation of this. So when we look at this map, we've got the Nile Delta there, we've got the region of Goshen, and we've got the movement of the Israelites, which I've mapped on there. On the top there, you can see the red line that goes all the way up the coast, and it goes up into the land of Canaan, which is today's Israel. So that's the movement of Seti. Now he took several divisions of his army, and he actually went up through the Jezreel Valley to Beit Shean, and then his army split into several divisions, and they took out several opposing bodies of people there who were contesting the power. So he didn't find the Israelites, and then he heard that his father had actually passed away, so he went back. So this is all recorded in history, that he actually at this time did these things. Now we know that at Beit Shean, when you go there today, there's actually a governor's palace, and I'll pass that picture around in a moment. On top of Beit Shean, it's actually an Egyptian governor's palace. So they controlled all of these trade routes at this time. So these were well walked or well-travelled trails. So just have a look at that and refresh your memories, and you can see the direction that they walked. So I'll just explain as we're going. So during a period of over 300 years, whilst the Israelites had lived in Egypt, the Egyptians had maintained a presence in the land of Canaan. So most of the time, 3/4 of the time virtually, that the Israelites were in Egypt, the Egyptians were actually controlling certain parts of the land of Canaan. The reason why is because they control the trade routes up the coast, across the Jezreel Valley, over up into northern Mesopotamia was the main trade area, so they controlled it. So Beit Shean, as it's called. Now Beit Shean, I think I told you before, it actually means the house of rest, so it's a place where they stop when they're travelling. So it serves as a centre for the rule over the northern region. It's strategically located, and as you'll see on this picture as I pass it around, it's quite an impressive place. So again, I'll keep talking as I show this, so again we'll post this on YouTube. The top picture here, this is the ancient tell. It's extraordinary, it's massive, it's so huge, it's like this huge hill. So up on top of the ancient tell, in the foreground you've got Scythopolis. I'll get it out. So Scythopolis was the Romans when they went there, and they rebuilt this. The Byzantines went there as well. But up on top of the tell, they had the Canaanites ruins, there's Egyptian ruins, and there's Israelite ruins up there. So one of the ruins that are up there is this Egyptian governor's house. So on these pictures here, there is a picture at the bottom, which is what you see today. So they have all the exposed footings of the house, and the picture in the middle is an artist's impression of what it actually looked like. And of course, they built these everywhere, so it wasn't. They didn't have to sort of work out what it looked like. But that's up on top of that tell to this day. So we know that they were there. Okay, so when the Egyptians went up there, there was a couple of Canaanite kings in this region who were rebellious. Obviously the Egyptians were controlling, they were receiving taxes, etc., and obviously these people were rebelling. So the Canaanite kings of Hamath and Pahel, they tried, and they're on that map as I'm passing it around, they tried unsuccessfully to capture Beit Shean, so they actually attacked this place. So Seti sent his 3 army divisions, which are marked on the map, to relieve Beit Shean. The Amen division, known as the Mighty of Bows, went south along the Jordan River, conquering the cities of Rehob, Hamath and Pahel. On the other side of the Jordan, the Re division, RE, known as the Plentiful of Valor, they secured Beit Shean itself, whilst the Seph division, known as the Strong of Bows, went north and conquered Yanom, Hazor and Beth Anath, so that's on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. These actions strengthened the Egyptian hold over Canaan considerably, and as I said, the evidence for all of this, by the way, comes from a stele. I mentioned steles before, so these are the ancient rocks Often they were curved and they would carve in all of the history and the information. You see them in museums everywhere today. So all of this was actually carved into a stele. And so this movement of Seti and his army is all documented. So even though Seti's forces put down the rebellion, secured the Jordan River, the Israelite slaves, obviously, they didn't return. They didn't turn up on the other side. So then Seti heard about his father's body being recovered, and so he returned to Egypt, and he was crowned the next king of Egypt, or the next pharaoh, and he was known as Pharaoh Seti I. So at this point in time, you can imagine Seti's gone back. The whole of the leadership of Egypt's been decimated. He doesn't know where the Israelites have gone. You know, they're in the Sinai down at the bottom. They don't maintain fortresses down there. They don't patrol down there at this point in time. So as far as they were concerned, they had no idea. So they just dropped it. So what God actually did was send them one way, turned around. He went looking for them this way. His father chased them the other way. His father was killed. The leaders were killed. And Seti went looking for them further up. Didn't find them, come back, got crowned. But now the Israelites are gone and they're saved. So that's the historical background that's connected to the biblical story. So going back to the Bible, going back to Nahshon. So Nahshon, here we are, they're out in the desert, they're on the other side. And so he's leading the tribe of Judah through what's called the desert of Shur. Okay, so the desert of Shur on the map, so just to the east of Egypt when you come out of the Nile Delta, that desert region there is called Shur. And the desert of Sin is below it, so that means they actually go across a little bit and then they go down to the Sinai Peninsula. But while they endured this hardship, straight away they started grumbling endlessly about the lack of food. Right? So they've come out of Egypt, they say they're groaning and crying out to the Lord, but they obviously still have food to eat. So they've gone out to the desert. I imagine their unleavened bread's run out. And there's no food source, you know, apart from the animals. But the animals that they bring with them, they're very limited. They're not carrying big flocks at this point in time. They are limited. And the other thing with the animals is that they're using the animals obviously for a particular purpose. Right? They're not actually eating the animals for a food source. Okay, so we enter into this period of time where they start to grumble. So their complaints joined a chorus of people vocalised by the Israelites, and the complaints are actually against Moses and Aaron, not against God. Okay, they see Moses and Aaron every day. That's who their leader is, so they moan and grumble to them. So in Exodus, we're in chapter 16 now, verse 12. The Lord heard the grumbling and told Moses that he must speak to the Israelites. And the verse says, "At twilight you will eat meat, and in the morning you will be filled with bread. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God." So what was the meat that they were going to receive?
Quail.
Quails, very good. All right, so it's like home delivery, fly in. They don't have to go and eat out, so to speak. And what was the bread? Manna. So we're going to have a bit of a look at this tonight. So as the sun sank over the horizon and dust settled over this landscape, there would have been a second darkness. Remember, there's 2 million odd people to feed. How many quail? How big are quail?
Small.
They're small, aren't they? So if I'm starving, how many quail am I going to? 5, is it?
No, you probably about 10.
Even Roger would get a couple down, I reckon.
Probably later.
So you can imagine, all those people, we're talking about millions of birds. So you can imagine, you see when you get a flock of birds in the sky, they sort of put you notice that like a darkness almost with all the wings and the sun on top, but the shadow underneath. You can imagine these millions of birds actually coming in and what the sight would have actually looked like. So they would have been literally like a darkness coming in. So they descended on the Israelite encampment, and so Nahshon, of course, along with all of his people, they would have been snaring the birds. And after they'd been prepared and roasted over the many campfires, they all gave thanks and ate their full. Now later on in the Bible, when we have the second lot of quails come in, it talks about how they get blown in on the east wind. So the Bible keeps telling us about the east wind. So the wind there comes from the east, so where Saudi Arabia is today, across the Sinai Peninsula towards Egypt. So what they believe is that the wind was so strong that it blew them in, but then God's like blowing them down almost, like they're being pushed down to the ground, because to actually catch these birds, to snare them, means that they would have had to be reachable, wouldn't it? So it must have been they were blown in, and then the wind conditions actually held them towards the ground to actually grab them all. So you can imagine the hive of activity, how many campfires would have been burning, and obviously they would have been giving thanks to God, because here He is, He's provided to them, and they've eaten their full. However, when the morning arrives, they get the next item on their menu, and it's not so regular or expected. It's nothing that they've known before. So when they arose, they would have got up from their tents. There's a heavy dew around the camp, which is what the Bible talks about. As sun rose, something odd occurred when the dew disappeared. So in Exodus 16 verse 14, it says, thin flakes like frost on the ground appeared on the desert floor. So Nahshon and everyone, they would have been examining this stuff, and they would never have seen anything like it before. All the people would have been questioning each other, and no one would have known what it was. So Moses says in verse 15, it is the bread the Lord has given you to eat. Well, everyone, you would have a picture of bread in your mind. You would, in our country, you would have a loaf or a breadstick. Obviously they're using unleavened bread or bread with leaven, but it's very flat, it's a lot thinner. So they would have had that picture in their mind when they were told they were going to receive bread. But in fact what they find is they have these white flakes. He then instructed them what to do, so they went about collecting, and it says, an omer for each person. So any of you with notes on your Bible will know how much an omer is. Anyone know how much an omer is? For each person. It would be at the bottom of your page if you've got sub-notes, usually.
It says a portion.
A portion, okay. Well, I looked it up as I like to look everything up, and it's approximately 2 litres. Okay. So put this in mind for the rest. They're going to be in the desert for 40 years. Each person collects 2 litres of this stuff. Multiply that by 2 million people, you're getting a picture of, I mean, it must have been incredible. This stuff covering the ground every day to feed the people. So I find this extraordinary. 2 litres per person per day, a couple of million, maybe more people, and God provides this every morning like a dew on the ground. Some extraordinary event. Okay, so the Israelites call this bread manna. Does anyone know what the meaning of the word manna itself is? It actually says it in the scripture in verse 15, if you're reading.
Isn't that like manna as in like horse poo or something like that, and they made something with it?
It's like what?
Like horse poo or something? And they
No.
and there's like going around?
No.
Like old.
I'm going to explain it further. The Bible actually says what the word manna is. And it says, it actually means, what is it?
What is it?
What is it? What is this stuff that God sent to us? Right? So that's what manna actually means. Okay? So it tells you that all of these people had never ever seen this stuff before. So here they are presented with it for the first time. So here's some information, and I know you'll know bits and pieces because there's a couple of different descriptions for it. But it says manna is described to be white like coriander seed, but looking like resin. When it was crushed and ground, it was either baked or boiled. That's from Exodus chapter 16, verse 23. So there's 2 ways that they processed it. And it says they were made into cakes that tasted like something made with olive oil. So that's in the book of Numbers, chapter 11, verse 8. So
Sarah says unleavened bread does not rise.
no, that's right. Unleavened bread doesn't. But and they wouldn't have been able to produce any bread once they ate the unleavened bread that they came out of Egypt with. So yes, you're quite right, Sarah. So it tells us that it tastes of something made with olive oil, Numbers chapter 11 verse 8. And then in Exodus 16:31, where we are, it says, this taste was like wafers made with honey. Okay? So does anyone know what a coriander seed looks like and how big it is? So I happen to have some here. So I'm going to pass them around, but I'll just hold some up for the camera. So this is coriander seed, and they're basically the size of small peppercorns, if you will. They're very, very small. So it says that they collected. You're welcome to eat one if you like. My son tried it earlier, and I'm not so sure that he enjoyed it. So that gives you a picture. The Bible tells us this. So it's like these little small pieces. So they're very, very small. So you can imagine going out in the desert, which is dust, sand, a bit of tundra, a few low shrubs, etc. And they would have been collecting 2 litres of this stuff per head every day. So the ground must have just been covered, literally like snow, as it says. Right? But peculiarly, it says that, tastes like something made with olive oil. It mentions resin, and it says like wafers made with honey. You could either bake them or boil them. So here's the thing. Every morning you get up, you collect your 2 litres of this stuff, and you either bake it and boil it, so you have to crush it, knead it, wet it. And so what does that mean? They need water. So we read throughout the Bible how they're constantly complaining about needing water. Obviously just to process their food, they need water. So can you imagine if I said to you, we've talked about this before, but imagine I said to you, look, for the next 40 years of your life, you're going to be picking 2 litres of this stuff off the ground, you're going to add a bit of water, you're going to mush it up, and then you're going to cook it, and it's the only thing that you're going to eat for 40 years. It's very challenging, isn't it? What would that do to you as a person? I mean, for me, if someone says, look, you've got to eat a kebab every day for 40 years, I'd probably manage. Or there'd be a dish that you would like. But take one element, one item of taste, and say that's what you're going to eat for the next 40 years. Who's been in hospital and had jelly and ice cream for a few days? And you get bored pretty quick. And that's jelly and ice cream. So here we've been told that it tastes like wafers with honey, so we can put it in the same category. But you've got to eat it for 40 years.
I eat this with honey.
So my wife says wheat bix with honey, but 40 years. 40 years. So what do you think that would do to your faith and your trust and your walk with God? How do you think you would go? It would, wouldn't it?
I'd want to go back to Egypt.
Right. And that's what happens, isn't it?
Isn't it probably in the beginning it grows because now they had, but as time gets by, you get more and more used to it. It's like when you're in the presence of God all the time, you get, yeah.
But did they get into the presence of God? You see, this is the challenging thing, right? They never actually came into the presence of God. In fact, the Bible tells us it's the opposite way around. God came and dwelled amongst them, but obviously in the tent, but they couldn't approach God. So it's like knowing someone's there for 40 years, but you can't go and say hello to them. How would you go with that? You're never allowed to talk to the leader, to God. Very challenging, isn't it? So here he is, he brings these people out of Egyptian slavery. They run the 10 plagues and they see these incredible things happen. They finally get to come out of the country. They watch their enemy be crushed by this canal or this body of water, only to find they've got to eat the same thing for the next 40 years. At this point in time, they don't know they're there for 40 years, obviously.
Yeah.
But that's what the outcome's going to be. But I think from a point of view, God was providing to you. So what's our takeaway from this? We go through life and we probably set our expectations up here. God will take care of us. What does that look like? Financial wealth, physical health, air-conditioned buildings, comfort, or does it look like something different, living out of the boot of a car, maybe being even lower? You don't have a home, a dwelling, a car. You're on the street. You're in a poor country. People live like this, and yet many of them, I would probably say, are closer to God often than people who have lots of material wealth and benefits. And so what this did is it made them solely dependent on God. In other words, they didn't have any other means of taking care of themselves. It was only by the hand of God. So they would have been in this twofold problem. You know, one side, they would have been saying, God's providing what I need, keeping me alive. On the other side, they'd be saying, but why are you doing it so sparingly? I'm suffering at the same time. So it'd be very challenging. So for us today, you know, if our situation's difficult, we can moan and whinge and complain, and we'll probably say, well, God's not actually in my life or taking care of me because I actually don't have much. So the problem is that we often, rather than saying thanks for what we have, we complain and whinge about what we don't have, and we sometimes fail to see God in it because of that. And yet what we should be doing is seeing that God's in it because of what we have, not what we don't have. So this is a lesson these people are learning in the most extreme way. So being told that this was a bread, the frosty flakes were crushed and ground into fine powder, as I said. They added water to this and kneaded it into a dough and formed the dough into small cakes, and then they would have cooked it in these two different methods. So we learn from this that the faith of the Israelites was constantly tested, but grumbling endlessly and desiring to return to Egypt, they put the Lord to the test. But he led them to Rephidim, a place called Rephidim, Rephidim, which was close to Horeb, his mountain. Okay, so I did pass a previous picture around. I will pass another one around about Horeb the previous week. This is a illustration of Moses with the water coming out, with the people around him. We're just about to read into that. The bottom picture, if you look on the highest part of the mountain there, I did mention before, that saddleback shaped mountain, that highest peak, that's actually Mount Sinai in the Sinai Peninsula. So a photo we took on the way there. So that's Mount Sinai, just there with the saddleback. So they would have been heading, if you look at that picture, again I'll post on YouTube, it's very arid, very hot, there's nothing growing there. So these people would have been making their way on foot, and they take them to this location called Rephidim. So having led the tribe of Judah from the desert of Sin southeasterly down the western side of the Sinai Peninsula, Nahshon would have been directing his people. They were responsible for their tribes to set up camp when they arrived at this place. But once again, the Bible tells us they just complained because there was no water here. So they were grumbling, complaining. They argued with Moses. How were they and their livestock going to survive without water to drink? Okay, so water is life. So a messenger came to Nahshon and the other leaders, and he was told to join with Moses as he walked ahead of the people towards Horeb. So they went up forwards of the main body of people. So the elders of Israel, they followed Moses until he abruptly stopped at a rock at Horeb. So he's at the base of this mountain now. Gathering around him, they watched as Moses used the staff of God to strike the rock. And as the picture shows, to their amazement, water gushed out of the rock. Nahshon went back to the people of his tribe and told them what had transpired. So of course you can imagine all these people who were grumbling and moaning, they would have been rushing towards the water. They would have had their jars they brought out of Egypt, they would have had their skins, and they would have filled them all up with water. And of course those who had any livestock, they would have taken them there to get some water as well. So Moses called this place Massah, M-A-S-S-A-H, and Meribah, M-E-R-I-B-A-H. Now those two names, Massah means testing, and Meribah means quarrelling. So it's giving us two messages, isn't it? It's really testing them, probably testing Moses as well, I imagine, and quarrelling, which tells you a bit about the character of the people who were fighting at the time. For the Israelites had quarrelled and tested the Lord. while they camped there, this is when we learn about the Amalekites. Does anyone know anything about the Amalekites? This is where they're introduced to us in the Bible. Who were the Amalekites?
Giants.
They were a giant race of people. Remember what they did here? So in other words, this tells you that on the Sinai Peninsula, even though they had escaped from the Egyptians, there was obviously other people that were moving around the Sinai Peninsula still. And so we learn about the Amalekites. The Amalekites were named after a person called Amalek, and he is the descendant of Jacob's brother Esau. And he came and he attacked them. Now this is where we learn a little bit more about the family as well. So we're now going to Exodus chapter 17 verse 9. Again, we don't have time to read the whole Bible in each lesson, so read your Bibles and freshen up on these. It says, we're first introduced to Joshua the son of Nun. So who's Joshua the son of Nun? He becomes the next leader after Moses when they go into the land of Canaan. So we're first introduced to Joshua at this point in time. And he's actually from the tribe of Ephraim. And the Bible tells us, obviously from that from Ephraim means he's a descendant of Joseph, isn't it? Because Joseph had two boys, Manasseh and Ephraim. When Moses said to him, this is verse 9 of chapter 17, choose some of our men and go out to fight the Amalekites. Tomorrow I will stand on top of the hill with the staff of God in my hands. So it tells us that Joshua was obviously a person who was trusted and capable in the ability, he was given this responsibility to go and fight their first battle, basically, as a free nation of people. This is their first battle. So we can know from this that Joshua was already a man. He had to be at least 20 years old to fight. Okay, you had to be 20 years old in their society to be a man who was able to go to fight. So Moses went up the hill next day, and with the help of Aaron his brother and Hur, and the Bible tells us that Hur is the grandson of Hezron, so he's another one of those descendants in the genealogy of Jesus. The staff of God was held aloft until Joshua overcame the Amalekite army. Moses built an altar there and called it, "The Lord is my banner." And that's in verse 15. From this day forward, because the Amalekites raised their hands against the throne of God, in verse 16 it says, "The Lord will be at war against the Amalekites from generation to generation." There's a famous descendant of the Amalekites. Does anyone know anything? There's a famous story in the Bible. It's huge. A whole book of the Bible is dedicated to this person.
Goliath.
No, it's a good guess. It's actually orientated around a female in the Bible. A female. What's one of the female books of the Old Testament? Esther. It's actually Esther. Okay. So what happens? There is the fellow who wants to rule, and he wants to kill all the Jews later on. Remember? So he's actually a descendant of the Amalekites, and one of the reasons that Mordecai won't bow to him is because of this history. This is where it starts. Because they were against them from the beginning, the Israelites, who then became the Jews later on, they didn't trust the Amalekites, and they almost became what we call a traditional enemy. Okay, so the story of Esther and Mordecai, and I won't go into it all, but basically the person who was governing, who wanted to come against them, he was actually a descendant of the Amalekites. Okay, and that's why Mordecai refused to bow to him, and that's what spurred the whole sequence of events that occurred at that point in time. So we do find evidence for what this says in the Bible much later on in history. Okay, so continuing on, after this defeat, the Lord said to Moses in Exodus 17:14, write this on a scroll as something to be remembered. So what's that saying about Moses?
He can write. He's literate.
He's literate, he can write, but God is telling Moses to... One of the things that you get taught is that Moses was responsible for writing the first 5 books of the Bible. So this is one of those evidence points in the Bible that God actually said to Moses, I want you to write this down. So it brings evidence to the fact that Moses was the one who was actually writing contemporary to his life, in other words, while he was alive. Right? So when they go up Mount Sinai a bit later with the commandments, etc., you can imagine Moses coming down with his long list of 613 commandments he's written down. But the history of everything that would have been occurring, Moses was responsible for that. But this is one of those lovely pieces of scripture that gives us evidence. So that's in Exodus 17, verse 14. Okay, and significantly that scripture was written whilst it actually happened at that point in time. So it's not something that's written much later. So when Moses, so we've got a bit of background here at this stage too. When Moses returned to Egypt in Exodus 18:2, so as I said, I'm just going to keep moving through the scripture. The Bible tells us he had sent away his wife Zipporah, his father-in-law Jethro received her and her 2 sons. So Moses didn't go to Egypt with his wife and his 2 boys. But he's no longer at Egypt, he's at Horeb, he's at the base of Mount Sinai, and so he's much closer to Midian, where his family was left behind. So after this miraculous escape from Egypt, the news of the Israelites would have spread quickly around the region. So obviously he would have heard that they were no longer in Egypt. So upon receiving this news, Jethro took his daughter and grandsons with him to meet with Moses where he camped. And Jethro praised and glorified God for all he had done. Okay, so we find at this point that Moses is reunited with his family. After surviving their first attack since leaving Egypt, news spread around the camp that Moses had been joined by his wife, as I was saying, Zipporah. The 2 sons were called Gershom and Eleazar, who had been brought by Jethro. Nahshon was called with all the other elders of Israel to join Moses and his brother Aaron. The Bible tells us in Exodus 18, verse 12, to eat bread with Moses' father-in-law in the presence of God. So we're not eating bread here, we're eating manna in the presence of God with Moses' father-in-law. Okay? So it says in the presence of God, which tells us that God was already above or on top of Mount Sinai. Horeb, Mount Sinai is the same place. Okay. So the next day, Moses spent serving his people as a judge, according to the decrees and laws of God, endlessly solving disputes until evening arrived. Okay, so what does that tell us? The commandments haven't yet been penned down as we understand it in the order in the Bible, and yet it's saying here that he's serving as a judge according to the decrees and laws of God. So does that mean that he already knows them? Of course. So does that mean society was already living by them? Not necessarily, because they're all refuting and arguing. So this is one of the things that's about to happen, is that God's about to put order back into his society. He's about to put the laws into place, and he's going to bring the priesthood together through Moses' brother Aaron. But we can see from this that these laws and decrees were already in place. So Jethro saw that this workload was not sustainable, so before he left to help Moses, he helped Moses to organise a judicial system where officials were appointed as judges. So in Exodus chapter 18:21, it says there was judges over thousands, hundreds, fifties and tens. Okay, so we can imagine we're talking about different quantities, so that the responsibility and the nature of what those complaints were being handled would have varied according to the number of people. So the most minor disputes would have been in that largest number of category, wouldn't it? Whereas the things that got to the tens, they would have been pretty serious issues. And of course the Bible goes on to say that the most difficult cases were left for Moses to decide still. Okay. The other thing is that these judges, the Bible tells us there, that they were people who were deemed trustworthy and feared God. Okay, so that means these people were already walking with God as opposed to a lot of the population. Are there any questions on that? So there's a lot happening now, isn't there? They've just fought the Amalekites, they've left Egypt, we learn about their circumstances with what they're eating, we learn about they've gone down to Mount Sinai, The staff of God is significant because it's used when provision's required. And then we find out that the society is obviously squabbling because there's a lot of people, and so they're bringing in a judicial system now to take control of everybody. So there's a lot going on amongst this large group of people. Okay. So 3 months had passed at this point in time since they left Egypt, and they arrived in the desert of Sinai. Now once again here, people can test where Mount Sinai is, but the Bible tells us it's in the desert of Sinai. So this is another piece of evidence of where it actually is, as opposed to the parties who want to say it's in northern Saudi Arabia today. So Moses moved their camp again, and Nahshon led his people to be in front of the mountain of God. So we have the first instance now that Moses leaves them and he goes up the mountain. I passed that picture around of Mount Sinai, but to give you some perspective, if you haven't been there, Mount Sinai is 2,285 metres tall, so it's 2.3 kilometres roughly high. For those of you still working feet, it's 7,500 feet. The path that goes up there takes 3.5 kilometres of walking, or 2.2 miles, to climb to the top. So you go to Mount Sinai today, it takes approximately 4.5 hours to walk both ways on foot. But there's a trail up there now. So I imagine back then it probably took a little bit longer, probably half as much again. Yeah, you can get a camel, that's right.
Take a camel. You don't have to walk, you can get a camel.
Yep.
That'll take you up.
It would have been January. Can you imagine how cold that would have been?
Yes, very cold. Very cold. Good, Tim. Tim's tracking the months.
Snow.
Well, they're tied. I mean, the Bible is very tied to seasons, and it is significant because it affects what happens in a lot of instances.
There would have been snow on top of that.
Right, so it would have been pretty cool up top. Yeah. And down the bottom, the east winds would have been blowing. So it would have been very, because it's all desert, because obviously on the other side of the Gulf of Aqaba, which is today's Saudi Arabia, it's all desert as well. So we all know that desert's extremely cold at night time, and apparently the winds always blow from the east, so they would have been pretty cold, yeah, absolutely. So when Moses returned, Nahshon and the other tribal leaders, so the Bible here, it doesn't mention Nahshon by name anymore, but we know he's one of the tribal leaders because he leads the tribe of Judah. Okay, so all these events that are in the Bible that you're reading, Nahshon is part of it. So he's one of the descendants in the genealogy of Jesus, but he's not mentioned by name all the time, he's just mentioned as one of the 70 elders. Okay, so he was there. So they were called and told what the Lord had said. So in Exodus chapter 19 now, verses 4 to 6, it says, "You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." Big statement. It's talking about keep my covenant. What covenant is that? Who was the covenant made with? Abraham. So this is the Abrahamic covenant. Okay, so God promised them that he would take them into the land of Canaan and make it a land of their own, and he also promised them many descendants, didn't he? Well, here they are, they've left Egypt, they're a couple of million odd, so I guess they would believe they have many descendants by this stage, and they're obviously understanding that they're going to go to the land of Canaan, but God gives them a bit of a warning here. He says, "If you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations," so he selected them, "you will be my treasured possession." So this still stands for today, something we were talking about on Sunday. These are God's people, he called them out. Right? He says they will be a treasured possession. And it says, although, he's making it quite clear, isn't he, that he's the creator. "And although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." So he sees them as the head of all nations, right? Which is one of the issues we're having in modern times now with the United Nations. They don't want to see Israel as the head. So they all responded together in answer in verse 8. They said, "We will do everything the Lord has said." So in Exodus 19 verse 9 it says, so that the people will hear me talking with you and will always put their trust in you. So obviously at this point in time we understand that the people are grumbling to Moses and to Aaron because they see them as the leader. So they're obviously not in communication with the Lord. So God's actually saying to them that I'll come down so that people can see who I am. They'll hear me talking to you. So obviously these people, a lot of them, they're probably just not walking with the Lord. They're probably not necessarily believing. Even after everything they've seen, 3 months in the desert, and suddenly they're drifting away again. And that happens for us in life, doesn't it? We can be very close to the Lord at times, and we have circumstances come against us, and suddenly we're out in the wilderness. And it can happen really, really quickly. So this applies to us today as well, and we find that this is certainly the case. So 3 days later, Nahshon and all of the people there, they would have rose to the sound of thunder. Can you imagine the morning when God arrived? He stepped out of his tent as they all would have. They would have had freshly washed clothes on because they were told to consecrate themselves to God. They would have had to wash with water. We hear from this that they didn't have water readily available, so this was a big deal. And joined his people as they looked up in the direction the sound came from. He would have seen the thick cloud hanging over the mountain, and the darkness was interspersed, the Bible tells us, by constant flashes of lightning. So you can imagine them looking up this great big grey cloud, flashes of lightning. So this is an extreme event. They would have known that obviously something was going on here, and they knew what it was because God said that he would come. So it then talks about a very loud trumpet blast. And obviously none of them would have heard anything like this before. So they would have been in awe at this point in time. They got out of the morning, they were told to get ready, get to consecrate, come out of the tent, dark clouds, lightning going, and then hearing this huge trumpet blast. So they know that something's going on. You can imagine the fear that was through them, the reverence for God. And Moses had come back down at this time. He called out to all the tribal leaders again, and obviously Nahshon and all the tribal leaders led their people towards the mountain, and they were all told to do what? Remember when Moses met Aaron and he went to the mountain and God said, take your sandals off because this is holy ground?
Yeah.
So in other words, Moses was actually allowed to go on it, but he had to take his sandals off. So there was a pre-warning there that this was God's place. And so here they are, these people were coming up, and they were told to stand at the foot of the mountain, and don't go up. So as they arrived at the base, there was a series of markers put down, so there were limits not to go past. And that was because it was holy and set apart. So Moses told them in verse 12 of Exodus 19, be careful that you do not go up the mountain or touch the foot of it. Whoever touches the mountain shall surely be put to death. Wow. So you've left Egypt, you've gone through all this stuff, you've come through the desert, you get there, and they say, don't touch that, you'll die. So they're really creating an understanding to people that God is all powerful and that this is holy ground, and actually what it actually means to be holy ground. In other words, they're not permitted to come into contact with anything that was holy. Why? Because holy means that it's without sin, and they were all sinners. So they were not permitted to go past this particular boundary. So you can imagine this huge crowd, a couple of million people, the message would have been, pass back, don't push, don't go any further. And you would have had this audible sound and all communicating. So in verses 18 to 19 of Exodus 19 it says, Mount Sinai was covered with smoke because the Lord descended on it in fire. So now we have this introduction of fire. The smoke billowed up from it like smoke from a furnace. The whole mountain trembled violently and the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder. So we can visually paint this picture that there's smoke going like a furnace. So obviously it's ascending into the sky. And again, the mountain's physically trembling, so they would have had a physical reaction to it. The Bible says violently, and the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder. So they would have been obviously in this great awe and reverence of God. So his presence, God's presence, was palpable. So Moses spoke, and God calls him back to the top of the mountain again. So I'm just going to finish on this note because next week we're going to pick up with the Ten Commandments, and it's a good place to sort of to start from. So Moses went up the mountain, and then he was told to go back down. So we start finding as we read the Bible that Moses is sort of going up and down a few times, up, down. So how old was he again?
83.
80. Aaron was 83. He was older, so he was 80.
6.
So they've been, sorry, yeah, adding years, Rog. So Aaron was 83.
Sorry, 8.
And Moses was 80, that's right. So he's in his 80th year, 81st year, let's say. And here he is, he's been called to go up and down this mountain. So he had to be fit, that's right. So God tells him to go back down again to bring Aaron back up with him and reiterate the warning to the Israelites not to go past the limit set at the base of the mountain. And in verse 24 of Exodus 19 it says, "But the priests and the people must not force their way through to come up to the Lord, or he will break out against them." What do you think that means? He will break out against them. They've been warned that something will happen to them if they go up. So in other words, he's going to do something to them, isn't he? He's going to kill them, as he said. So they're reiterating this warning. So Moses returns with his brother this time, and God spoke to the Israelites, the Bible tells us. So in other words, remember he said that they would hear God talking to them. This part of the Bible says that God spoke to the Israelites. And in Exodus 20 verse 2 it says, "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery, and gave them his 10 commandments," which we go into next week from verses 3 to verse 17. So at this point in time, suddenly they're no longer just journeying, feeling aimless. They've arrived at this holy ground. God's on top of the mountain. They have this warning that the mountain is holy, that they'll be killed if they go past it. And of course, they have the physical presence of God, which they can see by all these different activities that have happened. And then finally here, he actually announces, "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery." So this is the first time and the only time that the general population of the Israelites actually audibly hear from God.